Chicken breast is one of the most commonly cooked proteins in the world, but it's also one of the easiest to mess up. It can be dry, bland, it can have a weird woody texture sometimes, or maybe you just make it the same way over and over and it gets boring. Well, in this video, I'm going to cover the 5 common mistakes that most people make, but from a food science perspective, because each of these mistakes build on the last one. So by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what to do differently, but more importantly, why these changes work and how to make chicken breast that's juicy and flavorful every time. And mistake number 1 is quite simple: buying the wrong chicken. From a flavor standpoint, chicken breast is very bland in terms of taste and aroma, and here's why. On a 100-gram baseless, boneless, skinless chicken breast is made up of around 74% water, 23% protein, 1 to 3% fat, and then 1% minerals and kind of other little things. And whether you are cooking with a $3 per pound or a $9 per pound chicken breast, if you just sous vide it and add nothing else, both of them are going to taste bland and boring. Most of the taste and aroma in chicken dishes comes from how we season and cook it, whether that's with salt, spices, or frying versus grilling. And the key point to know is that the flesh itself isn't going to taste radically different from breast to breast. However, where the choice of the chicken you buy at the store does matter is the texture. And if you've ever bitten into a chicken breast that maybe felt woody, fibrous, or just kind of unpleasant in some way, that's exactly what we're talking about here. All chicken breast is made up of muscle fibers that run throughout the meat, and the bigger the breast, the bigger those muscle fibers will be, especially in the faster grown, lower cost bird. And on the other hand, the smaller the breast, the smaller the muscle fibers are, which tend to give them a slightly more tender and delicate bite. And I broke this down in my expensive chicken breast video, where you can literally pull apart those long ropey fibers in a large breast, and when you compare it to the smaller one, when you bite into it, it's just fundamentally a different texture. And personally, when I'm at the store, I will look for the packages with these smaller size chicken breast. I've found that these have a more consistent texture from package to package compared to the larger breasts that can have a bit more of a fibrous quality to them. Also, if you've ever had that woody texture in chicken, here's how to avoid it. This phenomena is sometimes called woody breast syndrome and is caused by a muscle abnormality that can affect the faster growing commercial broiler chickens. So to avoid this, you should test the chicken before you buy it with your finger. If the breast feels rigid, hard, or swollen, you should probably avoid it. Additionally, if you see any weird coloring or striations in the muscle, that's another indicator to look out for. A normal breast should feel pliable and slightly soft and be a uniform color throughout the muscle. That being said, this does all come down to preference at the end of the day. If you've never had an issue with the texture of your chicken, I would recommend just saving your money and focusing on the cooking technique and seasonings instead. Because the next biggest mistake that most people make after buying their chicken is not using enough salt. Now, before we talk salt, I have a little bonus mistake for you, and that is not preheating your pan properly, and it's brought to you by today's sponsor, Made In. One of the issues that people run into when they try to cook chicken breast on stainless steel is that it tends to stick, but this can be solved if you simply preheat your pan properly. Stainless steel is actually fantastic for searing chicken, but the reason the food sticks is usually because 1, the pan isn't hot enough, and 2, you haven't added enough oil. At home, I'll give it a nice drizzle of oil, then aim for around 450 degrees Fahrenheit before tossing in my food. And that chicken will release when it's ready, giving you beautifully seared breasts in no time. And when it comes to stainless steel, I've chosen Made In for over 4 years, even before they sponsored my videos, because of the superior performance and durability. You can bang it around, throw it in the dishwasher, and it'll last for years. So head to the link in my description to check out the stainless collection and my other favorite cookware from Made In that I'm gonna use all throughout this video. But now, let's talk about salt. If you've ever wondered why chicken tastes better in a restaurant or from a takeout place than at home, it could be the spices, but the underlying issue that you should check on first is how much salt you're using. And many people just sprinkle a little bit on top and wonder why their chicken breast tastes flat. And the reality is, chicken needs more than that. A good general rule of thumb that I like to tell most people is 1 to 1.5% salt by weight of the meat. So for a 250 gram breast, this would be 2.5 to 3.75 grams of salt. And learning to do this by weight is important because every salt out there has different densities. A pinch or a spoonful of a fine table salt versus a bigger flake salt will likely be a couple of grams of difference, so it is important to do this by weight or just do some testing by volume for yourself. And I highly recommend recreating this experiment I did in the salt deep dive, where I added 0 to 4% salt to some chicken, because this is probably the fastest way for you to learn what not enough salt tastes like, and just as importantly, what too much salt tastes like. Undersalted chicken tends to taste like diet food, while properly salted chicken tastes like dinner. Now, using an appropriate amount of salt will fix the baseline taste of your chicken, but the next mistake is stopping there. And if you've ever gotten bored of eating the same chicken breast over and over, it's likely because of mistake number 3, not using a variety of spices. Again, chicken breast doesn't bring much aroma on its own, but this is one of the reasons why it's so popular, because you can use it as a blank canvas. It can be used in sauces for buttered chicken, marinated ahead of time for grilling, breaded and fried, or cooked with a simple spice rub. And a lot of our flavor perception comes from aroma, and one of the easiest ways to never get bored of chicken breast is to experiment with spices. And here are 3 of my favorite methods. First up is the single spice crust, where you load up one spice to the point that you can sear it and create a crust on the outside. The obvious one here is black pepper. It is classic and phenomenal, but you can do this with any spice you have in your drawer. Cumin, coriander, chili powder, whatever you like. Then you can mix that single spice chicken with the other components in your meal, like sauces, salsas, or the form factor, and it feels like this great intentional dish. The second method are 3 spice blends, and this is where I only pick 3 spices that play well together. No more. One of my go-tos for tacos, burritos, or rice bowls is cumin, smoked paprika, and garlic powder. Another combo I like is oregano, red pepper flakes, and garlic powder for some kind of Italian vibes, or you could swap in turmeric, coriander, and chili powder for a more global flavor. And the third method is to simply buy a pre-made spice rub or sauce. If you ever see something at the grocery store that looks interesting, just buy it and give it a try. One of my all-time favorite rubs that I always keep on hand is a za'atar mix. And there are different regional variations, but it's typically a core of dried thyme, toasted sesame seeds, and sumac. Another couple of my favorite seasonings for chicken are chipotles and adobo, or I'll just add some buffalo sauce and add it after the cooking. Now, one word of caution for pre-made rubs and sauces, just make sure to check the label. If the mix or sauce already has a lot of salt added, you probably want to cut back on that 1% number I talked about in the prior section so it doesn't become too salty. And lastly, regardless of which method you use here, make sure you use way more than you think. I talked about this in the spice mistakes video, but our perception of aroma tends to have diminishing returns, so it's very hard to overdo it in most cases. And I did that experiment where I added ridiculous amounts of spices to some chicken, and it all turned out great. Okay, so now we should understand the basics of buying chicken, how much salt to use, and how to test out a variety of spices. But even if we get all of those things right, we will still end up with dry chicken that no one wants to eat. And this brings us to mistake 4, cooking a thick breast. When I was young in college on my own several years ago, I would just take the chicken breast straight from the package, toss some salt and spices on, then cook it to 165 degrees, and every single time it would come out dry. However, if you take that same chicken breast and simply thin it out with a knife or pound it out flat force or cut it into some cutlets, you will instantly make tender and juicier chicken because it cooks more evenly. You get more salt and spice coverage since there's more surface area, and thus every bite will be evenly seasoned. You also create more surface area for the Maillard reaction, which is the browning that adds tons of new aromas. And maybe the biggest benefit of all from a lifestyle perspective is that it simply just cooks faster. And to show you how much of a difference this makes, I put this through a quick test and can show you some temperature graphs that will explain how this works. To test this, I took 2 identical chicken breasts, each weighing 310 grams. One I left thick and bulbous straight from the package, the other I flattened out with a knife. Then I placed in probes from a ThermalWorks RFX, which has 4 sensors tracking the temperature over time into each, then cooked them both to 165 degrees Fahrenheit internal into the very center. And here's what happened. The thin breast cooked in just 7 minutes and 45 seconds and finished at 268 grams. The thick breast, on the other hand, took a whopping 22 minutes and finished at 239 grams. Now, both of these chicken breasts were technically cooked to 165 degrees in the very center, but that is only in the very center, and this is where the problem lies. Most people aim for 165 degrees in the center, but with a thick breast, that means the outer layers are much hotter than 165 degrees by the time that center finally gets there. And you can see this in the temperature data. The sensors clearly show this separation because they are measuring outside the very center. And as a chicken breast cooks, the proteins tighten up, squeezing out that free water, which then evaporates. And the hotter the meat gets, the drier it becomes over time. And simply thinning out the breast shows that those sensors reach 165 degrees all at roughly the same time. And I know this kind of seems simple, but really from a food science perspective, this is probably one of the most game-changing things that you can do at home, and it instantly will help you make better chicken. Also, as another bonus, you can thin out a breast before you freeze them, which helps them thaw faster, or as I've shown, you can thin them out into cutlets and bread them and cook directly from frozen. That being said, if you're cooking chicken breast and can't or don't want to thin it out, like maybe you're roasting a whole chicken, this brings us to the final mistake, and that is always cooking your chicken breast to 165 degrees. And yes, the USDA does recommend cooking your chicken breast to 165 degrees Fahrenheit, but the question you maybe have not asked is, what is special about 165 degrees? Like, why is it not 180, 190? Why is it not 120 or 130? And 165 degrees is not some magic number. It's because at that temperature, you get an instant 7-log reduction of salmonella, or in other words, food safety. But food safety is actually about time and temperature together, and industry tables for poultry ready-to-eat products show exactly how this works, where you can see 155 degrees is safe in about 45 seconds, 160 for around 14 seconds, and 165 gives you that instantaneous number. So while 165 degrees gives you that instant 7-log reduction, you can hold chicken at a little bit of a lower degree and get the same lethality for much more juiciness. And you can use a thermometer here and experiment with 155 or 160 degrees, and you'll see this difference immediately. Personally, I like to temp my basic chicken breast at 155 degrees Fahrenheit and ensure it holds there for 60 seconds. And this is much more important for chicken breasts because they have so much little fat compared to something like chicken thighs or beef cuts, which have a lot more fat that will melt and connective tissue that benefits from being cooked to higher temperatures. Remember, chicken breasts are basically water and muscle fibers, so we need to hold on to as much water as we can during that cooking process and make sure those protein muscles aren't squeezed completely dry, all while still being safe. And hopefully now you can see the big picture of chicken breast on what to do differently and why it works. First up, if you don't like the texture of your chicken, look for those smaller breasts which will have smaller muscle fibers and generally a more tender bite. Also, to avoid those woody ones, give them a light press before you buy them. The breast should feel soft and pliable. Second, salt properly. A good general rule is about 1 to 1.5% salt by weight. Third, don't shy away from spices, whether it's a single spice crust, a 3-spice blend, or a pre-made mix or sauce. Fourth, thin it out so it cooks evenly. And lastly, use a thermometer and understand that food safety is a function of time and temperature. So you can cook it to 155 or 160 degrees, but hold it there for a little bit longer to match your preferred doneness. So anyway, that will wrap it up for me in this. Hopefully you guys like this breakdown and truly can understand how to make great chicken breast at home. So that will wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all.